Now, there's been a lot of argument about this, but certainly there is a definition of a scientific theory, and Darwinism does not meet that criterion at all. Basically, a scientific theory is something which must be capable of being falsified if it's true. But Darwinism can't be falsified. It's an infinitely elastic theory. It just simply gobbles up all and every evidence it's offered and says, oh yes, that proves Darwinism is true. In one sense, you can understand people's reluctance to drop Darwinism because, apart from the fact that it's an attractive theory, there is also a scientific principle. It's called the principle of tenacity, that you shouldn't junk ideas just because a few anomalies have come along. The trouble is that the anomalies with Darwinism are so enormous that they're now greater than the theory itself, and so we should start questioning this principle of tenacity. We should start questioning, should we be hanging on to this theory regardless? Some people have said to me, how can you criticise a theory if you don't have something to replace it with? Well, I don't accept that. If the emperor hasn't got any clothes on, then the emperor hasn't got any clothes on. It's not my fault. A lot of people are rather prone to shoot the messenger because they don't like the message. It seems to me that if Darwinism is wrong, then somebody has got to point the finger. I suppose if you ask me to evaluate Darwinism, I'd say that there is a certain amount of weak circumstantial evidence in favour of natural selection having some influence on evolution. But if you ask me to say, can this account for the origin of species, that's the question that Darwin was trying to answer, I'd have to say, no, it can't account for the origin of species. Natural selection is significant in evolutionary terms in one sense, and that is that it can account for variation within a species. For example, how you can have a light moth and a dark moth, and how one can change into the other. You could also point to the Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, where they say that there are 14 different species, each adapted to a different island. Actually, they're all members of the same species. Is there any evidence that the rocks of the Earth's crust have formed rapidly and all at once rather than slowly over billions of years? Well, yes, there is a certain amount of evidence, and ironically, there's a piece of it standing right outside the Natural History Museum in London. There you'll find there's a fossil tree. It's maybe 30 feet tall. What does this tell us? Well, if a tree is going to be buried and fossilised in something that's going to become rock, it obviously has to be buried all at once, otherwise the tree will simply rot away. Anybody can see that. This tree, in order to become fossilised, had to be buried in 30, 50, 100 feet of sediment very rapidly, and yet the scientists who work in the Natural History Museum continue to believe that the rocks of the Earth's crust had to be formed very, very slowly over billions of years, just tiny amounts of sediment being deposited each year. There's plenty of other evidence of rocks being formed relatively quickly through apparently some kind of catastrophe. For example, on every continent there are beds full of the bones of millions of animals. And you can contrast this with cases that we know of where millions of animals have been killed but haven't turned into fossils. For instance, on the Great Plains of America there were 60 million buffalo when white settlers arrived. They were all killed in a very short space of time. But there are no buffalo beds forming on the Great Plains. Those animals, after they were killed, they were simply eaten by scavengers. When you look at buildings like London's Natural History Museum, it looks almost like a cathedral or a church, and in a way I suppose it is a kind of cathedral or church, or at least it's a temple to Darwinism. Inside you have all the exhibits that are meant to show that Darwinism is true. I've looked in that museum and many other museums, but I haven't been able to find the evidence that conclusively proves that Darwinism is true. But many, many people go to worship at that shrine, and many people do believe in Darwinism. I suppose you could call it a kind of religion. People come to museums like the Natural History Museum to have their questions answered. Is man related to the apes? Do man and the ape share a common ancestor? And when you look at the exhibits in the museum, you'd think that the question had been answered decisively, yes, we are related to the apes. What the museum doesn't tell you is that the exhibit is an interpretation of the fossils. It's a point of view, it's a Darwinian interpretation, and you won't find any other interpretation either in the Natural History Museum or any other museum. In one sense, I sympathise with Darwinists because they're simply looking for a rational explanation of the biological facts, and Darwinism is a rational explanation, a reasonable explanation. The trouble is, it simply isn't supported by the evidence. Let me give you one example, the famous Lucy skeleton that was recently found in Africa. The few bones that were discovered have been restored or interpreted as a missing link creature, half human, half ape. But it's important to bear in mind that those bones can be and have been put together in different ways to show different creatures. For example, an extinct ape who's not related to humans at all. The creature that's represented by Lucy, Australopithecus, is in fact the only so-called missing link that stands any chance of being recognised as a human ancestor. But as long ago as the 1950s, the eminent zoologist Sir Solly Zuckerman did a statistical analysis which concluded that Australopithecus was an ape-like creature and not a human-like creature. Yet Darwinists continue to believe that Australopithecines, like Lucy, are our ancestors. Darwinists have promised us a missing link, and so they've got to deliver. They've got to come up with one. Any missing link will do, it seems. Every so often a skeleton is found in Africa. Its discoverers describe it as being the missing link. The headlines come and go, and then later on, that skeleton, those bones are reclassified either as human or as ape. And so far, the missing link is still missing. Forbidden science sounds like a contradiction in terms, but what I mean by it is this. We're all familiar with the fact that Galileo was tried by the Inquisition and compelled to recant his belief that the Earth went round the sun. Now, that's not what I mean by forbidden science. That's really human nature, because we all of us tend to reject the new. But the members of the Inquisition that tried Galileo refused to look through his telescope. They refused to look at the evidence that would have told them he was quite right. And that's what I mean by forbidden science. It's the refusal by some scientists to look at the facts in front of them and evaluate them. Yes. Well, of course, when you've constructed a very elaborate theory and you think you've already explained and you've told the public that you've already explained an important part of science, then naturally you're reluctant to have that overturned, to changed overnight. Scientists have made a big investment of their careers, their futures, I suppose even their pensions, in believing certain theories, and when somebody comes along and tries to overturn that, then, not surprisingly, they're not very happy. Yes. It seems to be almost commonplace. Scientists are usually ridiculed when they make new discoveries, and this applies to people who we today regard as heroes of science, people like Michael Faraday, Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers. They were all absolutely ridiculed at the time that they made their discoveries. It was only later that they were regarded as heroes. Let me give you a really great example of scientific rejection. It's meteorites. In the 18th century, science decreed that meteorites didn't exist. They were completely unreasonable. Anton Lavoisier, who's regarded as the father of modern chemistry, said stones cannot fall from the sky because there are no stones in the sky. And museums all over Europe were compelled to throw away their meteorites as superstitious relics of the past. As a result, you won't find any meteorite in any museum anywhere in the world that's older than about 1800, except one huge one that fell in Germany that was just too big to get rid of. It appears that science is such an authority that people are willing to have the evidence of their own eyes and ears overruled if the theory is accepted by enough scientists. One of the fundamental premises of Darwin's theory is that a species can, if it evolves long enough, turn into another species. Now, this central idea is contradicted by every single plant and animal breeding experiment of the last 500 years. Every animal and plant breeder knows that there is a limit to the extent to which an animal or a plant can be changed. Ultimately, the line becomes sterile, or it simply reverts to the original type from which you've selected. This has even been given a name. Ernst Mayr, professor of zoology at Harvard, called it genetic homeostasis. And that simply means that there is a barrier beyond which evolution cannot pass. And I find it extraordinary that the world's biologists continue to believe in the infinite plasticity of individuals when they know perfectly well that experiments show that it simply can't happen. Darwinism says animals can evolve indefinitely. Our experience of the real world is animals and plants have a definite limit beyond which they cannot go. A good question would be, what would it take for me to change my mind, to become a Darwinist? Well, the answer's relatively easy. The whole Earth's surface is covered with sedimentary rocks, and in those rocks there are fossils. It ought to be possible to go to those rocks and to find a sequence of fossils, one species turning into another species, turning into another species. In fact, it ought to be possible for the kids at the local kindergarten to do this on an afternoon's nature study at the local quarry. But the world's greatest paleontologists, with the resources of the world's greatest universities at their disposal, have failed to do this, and they've been looking for more than 100 years. It is an extraordinary phenomenon that Darwinism is a theory which is universally accepted. It has no competitor